Hello, and welcome to our weekly Triton 37 knowledge streams. Before we start, let's do some business. Click some like, subscribe to follow our future streams. We do those weekly and gonna continue them. Let us know where you're joining from, so we have some comments, so we can make the YouTube gods happy. And last week we talked about DevOps, and today we have Lukas from our Stockholm office, and he's gonna talk about design. So without taking too much time from Lukas, let's carry on and Lukas, take it from here.
Thanks, Miao. Hi, everyone. Yes, I'm Lukas. So thanks for joining. That's pretty exciting. And I hope I provoked all of you with the title of the webinar, Design is Not Important. I will explain what I mean. So before we get too many arguments out there, let me unpack that as we go. But let's kick this thing off. By the way, what I'm presenting, the documents are shareable, so feel free to reach out to us, and I'm happy to share this. So don't feel like you need to memorize everything right now. But yeah, let's kick things off. So thanks for joining. My full name is Lukas de Ridder. My first language is Afrikaans, funny enough. And that's how you pronounce Lukas or Lukas. And I was born in Johannesburg and moved to Sweden in 2016. Very happy about the move and just about the complement of cultures and how that helps us maybe think a bit wider about issues and agendas, the way we work, how we value our ethical baseline, and just getting a bit more exposure. So I'm a product designer at Triton 37, and let's say product designer, maybe UX, UI. This we will also delve into in just a bit. Terms are not important. The idea is that I'm a creative problem solver, and that's really it. So, all right. Next, I just wanted to share, all of you probably know already, but Triton 37 is a consultancy company, and we position ourselves to work with clients, business critical projects and their technology partners, helping them to create customized software mainly for the web. So we create useful stuff, and my job is to design, test, and iterate on that. So I'll also explain a little bit more as we go ahead. All right, so maybe first part, those of you who's joining, I'm curious why you joined. It's a very typical UX thing to do, to ask for feedback. But here are 4 options. So maybe type that in the chat. It'll be good for us maybe to just see where you're coming from. So the options are, number 1, I'm a designer and I want to learn more. Number 2, I'm not in design, but I'm curious. Number 3, I was forced into it. And number 4, not really sure how you got to this link, and I guess now the video is playing, but not sure why. So feel free to type that. If you type any numbers outside of that, we'll just assume our own options going from there. But yeah, go for it, type it in. So around that context, what I want to talk about today is, yes, why design isn't important, but the criteria for that is I'm going to talk about pre and post design system. So I'll also explain a little bit what design systems are for those of you who are not familiar with it, but I will not necessarily focus on design systems, but what happens pre and post design systems and why those are critical to bear in mind as well. Then next thing is organizational levels of critical thinking. So that is maybe a leveled way of problem solving. I'll explain it just a bit. And then the third one, we're going to talk about painting, spaghetti, and bubbles. And then the fourth one, we're going to talk about ethics. So with that being said, let's kick this off. So yeah, I said design isn't important, but before everyone starts attacking, let me explain what I mean. So what do I mean with design isn't important? So design is a very variable term. So what do we mean by this? Is it visual design, business design, service design? We have so many terms out there. Is it product design? Is it some other type, fine arts design? What do I mean with isn't? Am I stating design isn't important? Or am I saying design at the moment isn't important, implying that it should be? So that is something that we can also argue about. And then what I mean with important, does it mean that it's prioritized right now, that it's useful, that it's under or overstated? So as you know, words are very flexible dependent on the situation we find ourselves in, and bias plays quite a big role. So This is the actual question or formula, if we can see it that way, but maybe design isn't important, is short enough for a webinar title for now. So bear this in mind. So the point of today, or part of the point of today, is to talk about design system readiness. So with design system readiness, if we bear in mind how many variables and assumptions and biases there might be around just design isn't important, we might have the same perception about design systems. Design systems is pretty set, but also open for interpretation and also timelines. So where does it start and where does it end? This is something that we'll talk about in just a bit. But we're going to talk about design system readiness, which is not necessarily doing design systems. So what is a design system? Basically, a design system is a structured way of approaching managing assets in a way that is unified and accessible by the majority of the company, of usually designers and developers, in order to use the same assets. So we have kind of a uniform UI and UX within the product. So basically, we have the same stuff that we use to design. They look the same, so they work the same. So there's no iterations. There's no 1,000 variants of a blue button. There's only one. So this is kind of a recipe that you set up and work together and also continuously try and improve on. But in essence, it takes something that's a little bit meh, which is a lot of variants of a lot of different things into a system. So in this case, a very neat studio is the analogy we'll follow. So that's what you do with the design system. Of course, there's a lot more benefits and it goes much more in depth than that. So, but that is maybe the elevator pitch for now. So design systems are amazing, but I find that they're often served hot and fast, I guess similar to coffee. So you'll see on the right-hand side, serving coffee hot and fast is maybe not the most ideal situation. Coffee is great, and I'm an absolute coffee snob, I guess, or coffee hipster, but not if it's necessarily served hot and fast. And this is something we need to bear in mind, the time limitation of design systems. So how is it introduced? How is it in progress, and how is it handed over? So the whole life cycle is very important to bear in mind. So perhaps not going for it steamroller style, but thinking about it holistically. So design systems, I just wanted to share, this is a typical example of what a design system is. This is just really a very short snippet and the artifacts of a design system, really. So the results, or what is made of a design system, are the parts that you put together in order to make a UI. A design system is moreover, I guess, the process design. So how do we work together? How do we know where the assets are? How do we share that? How do we come up with new ones? And also talking about the limitations. So I guess if we start developing buttons, buttons might become components, components might become pages. So then if we templatize a page, do we not constrain design to be exciting or different? It will be uniform, but it will be super uniform. So these are the types of conversations that you also include within the design system, these types of limitations and freedoms. How do we balance that out? How do we maintain that? And how do we keep that in a reasonably clean state? So usually the assumption is that this is a design system. These are just the outcomes of a design system. Design system is more over communication and planning. Right, so in general, the ingredients of a design system could be divided into the design part and the development part. So there are different phases. So usually it's about the auditing phase for both design and development. So auditing implies we see what is out there. So how many things do we have and how many things do we need to try and combine? Then after we found out how many things there are, we establish a plan. So how do we conform this? Or how do we unify this? Or how do we plan to have only one version of a button instead of 10? And the next process is where design and development will then meet. So we find and merge the design, sync this with the team to find out whether it's plausible or not, and then try and publish that. And then we keep that cycle going. So rinse and repeat. The next phase is to update, improve, and release. So once, I guess, we've done the audit, we have an idea of how many things are in the library right now, and they are somewhat uniform. The idea is that we need to maintain, and this is usually the largest part, not necessarily the previous three. So how is a design system maintained? Because there's kind of a natural entropy that occurs within the design system, especially within a larger structure where there's a lot of input from a lot of stakeholders or designers that are working with assets. But they might need variants of that. So therefore you create a branch or a variant, or maybe you'll dislocate one asset away from the design system, which then kind of creates this messiness again, which is completely fine. But the idea is that you gradually move toward the established design system. So this is a design system, in my opinion, at least. The system of having the same assets and same corporate ID and narrative within the UI for us to implement that development-wise. The thing, though, is that a design system is the homework that we're doing in order to get it done. But there are areas that precede and follow a design system, which is the ramping up toward a design system, and also the gradual handover or sustaining or I guess, spreading of a design system into a larger area. And this is something that needs a lot of attention and is often overlooked, I find. For today, though, we're going to focus on the pre-area, and this will connect a little bit more on the title that design isn't important. So before design systems, what I would like to focus on, let's say, rather than the ingredients of a design system, it would be the collaboration toward a design system. Any company or any person can create a design system. It doesn't necessarily mean that it is useful or that it is used for that matter. So you might run into a situation where you have an absolutely amazing design system, but it's not necessarily utilized. And that might be due to a few reasons. So perhaps development isn't ready, perhaps business hasn't really allocated time for us to absorb that or migrate all of the products that we have from the existing version to the ones that's connected to the design system. So all of these are parts that we need to create readiness for. So that's why I would rather word the focus for today is the collaboration toward the design system. And this is not necessarily things that designers have to do. Hint that design is not important. This is also where painting, spaghetti, and bubbles come in. So I've come up with three patterns that I have noticed have come up quite often, which is, let's call it an easy win that you can do within a company that helps the collaboration toward readiness to implement a design system. So basically, are we ready to do this thing? If we start collecting assets and variants, are we ready to transpose that into something that we can utilize? These are things that don't necessarily need designers, and I feel like it's something that I want to share today, just because it's come up maybe organically within projects and clients that I work with. It's something that absolutely everyone can do, and it's kind of a mindset, and a lot of companies are already utilizing this, but it's good to share in case this might be news to you. So I'm going to go through each of the three, and the analogies, by the way, finger painting, spaghetti mapping, and bubble sorting is by design a bit goofy because it's a bit easier to remember. So keep that in mind. But basically what we're talking about, finger painting is collaborative ideation. Spaghetti mapping is network mapping, and bubble sorting is behavioral design, or the mechanics behind the behavioral design. Before we start, there are a few perspectives within design, or I guess strategy and UX and service design and all of these terms. I find they could be partitioned into three groups, which is business design, service design, and product design. So we were talking mostly about product design. So what is the thing that we are building, and what does it consist of? So usually assets, images, arrows, and boxes, right? So that is what we do in order to make a thing that people use. Service design is in the inspection of what things are out there, touch points, and which actors are out there, or people, and how are they connected with each other. So then if we create kind of an architecture or a communication or a structure of how this thing works, from that perspective, we can start optimizing this flow. So if we think about it, maybe SimCity style, how do we optimize the systems working together, and how can we lessen that in order to have perhaps the fastest route or perhaps the easiest route, dependent on what the outcomes are that you are pursuing. The top layer is business design, so that is a strategic direction that we're going into, and this entails change and strategy and business readiness, and also advocation and promoting forward. So this is kind of let's say the front of the ship. Which way are we steering and which way are we going? So this will also inform how things mature, which direction they will change in, and that will trickle down probably into how do we optimize the service in order to pursue that thing that business design has found we deem important. And then, of course, the bottom layer, product design, the things that we make will be the product of that. So I hope that makes sense. It's kind of three perspectives that I prefer looking at UX into. So kind of a mind shift into focusing on products, focusing on systems, focusing on the business. Also, into the roles, that's why I don't necessarily like to stick on one role, because I don't really know what is the buzzword at the moment, and buzzwords don't really matter. So I'm into UX, I do user research, and I do UX, and I do design. It's very variable, so don't feel like we need to set on the right job descriptions for these. On the right, you might see we have a lot of variants of a role, which are somewhat different, but also a little bit the same. So it's kind of in a spectrum, as we see here. I've put it in a semi-donut, how there might be areas of UX that we might focus on, or maybe a range of those, or maybe kind of a few picked of those. So each of us have a different profile. And that is completely good, actually, because we need to focus on different nuances, as opposed to way back in the day when we only had a visual designer and a developer. Things have changed, and this is also for the better, since we now have a more nuanced idea of how we build our profile. Bear this in mind, that you don't necessarily need to have done all of the certifications into visual design in order to be a specific type of designer. You can also have a lot of business acumen, a lot of experience in strategy, but have the perception that you want to create things for good, for the use of the end users or the person who is using the thing. That makes you a UX, in my opinion. Of course, it does require training, so not anyone can do it, but I hope everyone would, nonetheless, because the more UX we apply, I think the better and more ethical products we will create. All right, I'm going to start with the first analogy, finger painting. So the idea with finger painting is one thing that I've noticed that we do within companies, but maybe not necessarily in the right mindset, is that we need an online collaborative tool, especially now that most people are working online. And this might imply using Miro or using a board that we can draw on. And yes, we do that. And of course, we have PowerPoint and other presentation material. But the idea here that I'm trying to set in stone is that we have, in principle, an agreement that we try and do things on a canvas out loud. And the reason why is because it sets a principle that we want to work collaboratively. Also, we don't maybe keep our ideas too close, as we often do, and I do the same thing so often, where I like to prepare an idea beforehand and kind of justify that by shaping it to be perfect before I address it. But the idea with a collaborative online tool is that you work with it together. So what that does, it does expose you quite early in your ideas, and that they might fail or not be completely complete. And this is something that I've noticed is quite natural with designers, because now, for example, using Figma, that's a collaborative tool, and anyone can view what you're doing. And that at first was quite scary, because I did prefer disappearing into a cave, doing a design, coming up with a magic design, presenting it to everyone, and hoping it'll fly. But now with the idea of collaborative designing, that there has been some decrease in ego. So the idea is that everything that you do is fine, because you're trying to do better. And if someone comes across your canvas, and because in a lot of these tools you can actually see mouse pointers kind of lurking behind you, you can get feedback on that. And what that does to your perception of problem solving is that it is not something that you have sole ownership of, but something that you are sharing. For example, if you're building something together, there's not necessarily so much sense of self. there's a sense of team, which is something that helps us overlap our perceptions on things and maybe pushes out bias a little bit easier. So collaborative designing has been quite a major change in design, I feel like, with the coming of collaborative design tools. And this is something that I advocate that absolutely everyone does. So it might be in Mural or Figma. These are 3 examples that you can use, but it's not the point necessarily. The idea is that we ideate together and not ideate once an idea is final, but do it from the start. And that is for the purpose of creating something in bite-sized chunks into the right direction, instead of finalizing something and then hoping it's okay and then doing iterations on that. I've added a bit more detail just on the platforms that I've shown. So there are plenty out there, and I'm just sharing 3 of them. So the one is Figma. That's a design tool that we often use. It's also what I'm displaying the presentation in. At the moment, Mural is also another collaborative tool, and Miro is another one you can use. All of them are kind of, let's say, workshop-based, or Mural and Miro are workshop-based tools. So you'll see a lot of voting and stickies and organizational charts. They have some benefits and drawbacks. I think it's best that you check it out yourself. I prefer Figma just because I guess I design every day in Figma and I have a lot of freedom to do absolutely anything. So I prefer using that, although there's not necessarily yet a voting function, but there's a lot of functions coming in the future. Once I share this with you, I won't go through all of the text right here, but you'll be able to read a little bit more on collaborative ideation, which I call finger painting, on what are the benefits of doing that. Just adding on what I explained now, but I don't expect you to read it right now. Let's jump to topic number 2. So spaghetti mapping. So what is spaghetti mapping? So what I'm implying is this is network mapping. Network mapping is how you map an organization of people in the way that they communicate or handle things together. So yes, it's basically an information architecture of people and the communication lines. This is something that I've noticed come up quite often. And it's not necessarily a service design ask from a client, but it's something that comes out naturally, just, for example, that I didn't really know what I was supposed to do in a certain situation. So what I did is just map all of the people that are somewhat applicable to this, have interviews with them one-on-one, ask them who they interact with, and start visualizing this. And this I found to be incredibly useful because this asset that I've created, which is only actually for me to try and navigate into the maze of the company in order to find my way forward, this has been shared with a lot other colleagues at that stage, which is in leadership and planning and HR, because it just created kind of a map of how people speak together, whom they address, and what are their priorities that they're also addressing, all in one map. And this is an important part that, yes, you can do it in Excel, in a sheet, but we are wired in a way that we can comprehend something a bit differently if we can visualize it. So in the case that we can see a spaghetti map or a network map where things are connected to other things, we remember this a bit easier, and we can also find solutions in this a bit more laterally. So we can think creatively about solutioning this kind of structure if we wanted to optimize this, if that makes sense. You'll see on the right, this is a very pixelated, lo-fi view. This is by design, but this is one of the results that I came up with when I was spaghetti mapping myself in order to find my way forward in said project that I mentioned before. So what I did is each bubble at the very left corresponds to one product owner. Also the priorities that they have, or agendas, or things they need to check off, what that correlates to, and whom they address when speaking to it. So basically, I just ran through all of the people, asked them what are their priorities, what are they doing, and who do they speak to, and I started mapping them into kind of a spaghetti map, or I guess a web of connections. What this does then is you can start thinking about how you might optimize this. You'll see there are a lot of overlaps with the lines, and obviously if they're all parallel, that would make it a bit more easier to comprehend and also a bit easier to address. So that is what you can start doing. The people on the very right are, in that case, the specialists of a specific product. So they address all facets of different areas within different products, but that is pretty random, or it seems pretty randomized for now. What I did with this spaghetti map is I was able to restructure how we might address certain parts of a product with someone, or rearrange the priorities we have in order to have a neater structure. I hope that makes sense. But the principle here is to start mapping it visually, just to see these are the people, what do they do, and who do they speak to? That is really it. And once we have that, we can start improving on that. So this is something that I want to advocate, perhaps give it a try, maybe just by yourself, because I did this by myself as well. Just plot out how maybe your team or your company is structured, and just start building on it. It'll be absolutely amazing if we have a massive sheet that you can just sketch it on, but online tools are just as great, plus you can share it with people. So maybe go ahead with that. Spaghetti mapping, as mentioned, kind of helps that you can also structure things in the right order. So you can think about individuals, how they address, let's say, address from A to B, but also from A to group A, or then maybe group A to B. So there are different levels that you can start looking into. I would advocate just start at the start, plot connection lines, and then see if you want to make it a bit more intricate, then you can start thinking about levels. So for example, what entails a product, what entails a service, what entails a business, if that makes sense. I'll hand this over for you for homework reading, for those of you who are interested in reading a bit more. But for now, I'm going to go to our third analogy, which is bubble sorting. So bubble sorting is, I did computer science in high school, where we were taught, I guess it's a function on how you sort something from lowest to highest number if you have a random set of numbers. So how do you program that to sort it in the right way? And one method, and there are many, is called bubble sorting. I just kind of like the way it sounded, but I also like the principle of it. So with bubble sorting, what I'm talking about is the behavioral design approach on how we tackle things. So let's, for example, say we have a massive problem. So what do? Probably we'll have a workshop for 3 days and then try and sort it out, compile that, and then try and find a way for it, which is absolutely awesome. But sometimes we don't necessarily only have to do that because it is quite expensive and time consuming. Another option is to start behaving in a bubble sorting kind of way. So let me explain bubble sorting. If you have a random set of numbers, you start from the very left and see, is the very left number higher than the number next to that? In this case, 24 is higher than 7. So swap that one. Then take the second number, check if it's higher than the third number. If it is, then swap that one. Once you go through all of the numbers, they are slightly a bit better sorted, but they're not there yet. So the idea is that you do it over and over, and usually, depending on the amount of numbers, it's actually a bit less than you think, the amount of iterations that you need in order to sort the whole thing into the right order. So take this analogy of how we have a function that we would program to reorder numbers in the right order, and apply that to how we manage problem solving. If we have a super large problem, we don't need to rip it apart and try and solve it somehow with a massive idea. We could rather tackle a very, very minuscule part of it, and then compare it with another part, try and resolve that, and then move on from there. What that means is that you don't necessarily look at the holistic problem, but the parts of the problem. There's also a beginning and an end, which is a bit shorter, so there's no sustained focus on this massive thing. So it's a bit more in biteable size, but it's also quite modular. So in case you make progress forward, the idea is that you can call it, well, a day or a meeting for now, but have repetitive, super short meetings tackling one specific small section of a problem. Once you figure that out, call it a day and say, we have moved one part forward, and this is a checkbox. This also reinforces a bit more positive thinking in that workshops are often exciting, but quite exhaustive as well mentally. So if we have shorter positions of problem solving, that also kind of keep the pace up. And since the outcome is positive, it's a lot of positive reinforcement. So just for the mental health of everyone, this might also be something worth trying out. So I hope it doesn't sound too fluffy. In principle, to summarize, if there's a large strategic problem that you're trying to find out, only focus on 2 very small parts, try and solve that, call it a day, and then try it again and again, and try and do that concurrently, because the idea is creating a habit of tackling smaller problems frequently is a bit more consumable for our brains, and also reinforces a bit more for us to want to do that. So a little bit of behavioral manipulation, if you want to call it that. It has a bit more reading material. I've added an analogy of a burger. I will keep this secret for now for those of you who want to read more about that. There's a story behind that. But the next slide that I wanted to go to is maybe the summary of what I'm implying. So what we're talking about now are 3 methods on how you tackle preparedness for a something. So in this case, when I started with design systems, that is the something. Are we ready with the design system? What does that mean? Who is involved? How do we address this? How do we prioritize this? And how do we hand that over? By using these 3 methods, that might be stepping stones in order to create the collaboration toward, or the readiness for, in this case, a design system. And this is something that is not solely for designers or UXs or service designers or anyone, but this is basically just a mindset that you need to sustain and promote. It is unfortunately not a solo role, and it always entails a community, because that is the most efficient way to break down a problem, for example. But the idea is that this is openly shareable for absolutely anyone. Think about structured, creative, critical thinking. Think about the portions that you're addressing, and think about how you're visualizing problem statements. It doesn't necessarily have to be linear, for example, in an Excel sheet or a document, or can it be visual? Because then there might be a few more lateral capacities that your brain might step into to optimize this process. So that's, sorry, a lot of corporate fluff, so I apologize, but I hope that makes sense on this is something that absolutely anyone can address. And that is also where the title comes from. So design isn't important. It is the mindset of what we apply. So I feel like, yes, of course, you need to do some research into UX in order to become a proficient UXer, but absolutely everyone is a UXer to some extent. If they are willing to, since if you're in the area of building something technical for people to use, that has some responsibility implied, whether you're aware of it or not. So the thing that you build will have an effect on people. So the more you know, and the more you're open to that, the more empathic you are to gain information on how is this thing perceived that we designed or put together, the better for everyone, really, and the more ethical the product would be that you have put together. This is what brings us to the next, and this is a very large chunk, but that I'm absolutely passionate about, and this is the pursuit of ethical design. Note, I'm not calling it ethical design because I don't think anyone knows what ethical design is yet, because we're still figuring out, and obviously we can't state that there's an absolute truth. There is, though, the pursuit of the absolute truth of what is good for us to build. This is a note that I wanted to end on. Because this is really important, especially for Triton 37, that we try and produce products that are ethical. So what that means is that, does it create behavioral patterns that are negative? Does it create addictions? Is it exclusive to some people and maybe not? Are we reaching out to people to see, is it maturing the same way the company is maturing? And is the role that it's playing healthy for the larger community and not only the smaller community? This is something that a UX often thinks about, but is applicable to absolutely everyone running in a company that is building something techy that people can use. So this is becoming more and more addressed, and is absolutely the core of, I feel, of our designers, of what we do, is to think about at least what are the ethical implications and how can we think about it more healthily and more balanced. This is also a process, since we all have our biases, and we also build and change those biases as we mature into our lives. So we have this subset of filters that we look at the information. And this might put a filter also on the product that you are creating. So it should be the pursuit of us to try and devise a way to triangulate, is the perception that I have of the best result actually accurate? And we do this by validation and community designing. So do we design this together in order to mitigate these types of perceptions? And also, do we ask people this? So yeah, ethical design is maybe the platform of design in totality. And as we go forward, as you know, technology is advancing pretty quickly. So this will just be an increase on responsibility on what is the thing that we're building and what is it doing to actually humanity and the planet. And to that note, you'll see there's a background. I just thought this was absolutely lovely. This is phytoplankton blooming near Norway. It actually looks like oil, perhaps to some of you, but this is actually light-sensitive plankton. So this is a satellite photo taking of that. And it's just a message to say that sometimes it's important to delve into the origin of things before an assumption is made. But that being said, we went pretty fast, but I want to take a few questions on some of the notes. I hope I haven't rushed through all of that. But for those of you who have questions, please go ahead. This is absolutely a collaborative webinar, and I don't want to have a monologue at all. So please go ahead, type questions, be as blunt as you wish. I'm absolutely happy to address anything.
All right. Thank you, Lukas, for sharing your perspective and experience. I have a favor to ask for our audience first. We'd love to hear your feedback on this presentation. We dropped the link to the poll in the chat, or you can also see it on the sidebar if you're watching on our website. And yeah, as Lukas mentioned, drop your questions in the chat. We already have some, so let's go with those. What do you think about the atomic design approach?
Atomic design is in principle correct. I think we need to think about the levels that we are dividing them into. So, for example, if you have the atom, for those of you who are not familiar, atomic design is the perception of designing something from granular to a bit more larger components. So, for example, you have at the molecular level, maybe only the font size, and maybe if you want, maybe only the button, although that might already be a molecule. But if you ramp up the level, that then would be like very small components or things that are put together. The level above that might be a large component. So, for example, a map component or a search component. So these are chunks that you can then plot together in order to have a page in the case that you're, for example, creating an app. And then the topmost level is then a template. So what is a template that we use in order to build our thing from? What's good to bear in mind is that with some levels, we add constraints to the higher levels of atomic design, where in the case where we have templates or pages, that might constrain the usage in some ways, where it might also take too much time in order to provide variance or flexibility for the designers to work outside of that. For example, if you have a design system and you have multiple products that are both internal and external facing, it has to have both assets for both internal and external if the brand is somewhat different. If you then have a specific component, for example, a search component or whatever that might be, you might want a different response within that. If you've created, in that case, this template, which is constrained, for example, in Figma, you get the option to perhaps only change the inputs of the dropdown. You make it clickable. You can also have one or two dropdowns, but that's basically it. That means the designer has to request, what about if we want something a little bit different? So maybe the dropdown has emojis in it, for example. Then the process becomes that you need to address that to the owners of the design system. They make another variant of that, which you can then utilize. And that is a bit of a loop around, where I'm wondering at the moment if there's less and less constraints on the upper levels. So, for example, instead of having a component that is constrained and you're not really able to change that, but it's more just a collection or a group of the atoms. So you can tear that apart as much as you want, but the atoms are still connected. Then you have a bit more variance in order to play. So I don't really have the answer for that. That is a topic that I'm tackling at the moment because I absolutely love the idea of a design system, just on how organized that is and how unified vision we have. I'm also just finding there's sometimes a lot of situations where we need slight variance, but the process in order to make that happen is a bit longer than necessary. So that's where I'm sitting right now.
All right. And how do you think, like, how often should teams do finger painting or spaghetti mapping, those techniques you mentioned in your presentation?
I think the idea is to just start. About the frequency, that depends, because people have different calendars, so it depends on their commitment. If there's a team that's committed to doing this often, I would advocate perhaps, for example, the online collaboration, set that as a vision. So we often have a whiteboard open when we have meetings as well, just to kind of visualize what am I talking about. The more and more familiar you become with the platform, the more you can also speak to what the idea is, and people can change on that. So it's not necessarily only a verbal conversation. So in this case, the online collaboration is something you can just state. So let's give it a go. Let's see if it works. Maybe it doesn't, and we'll try an alternative. As for the spaghetti mapping, this is kind of a system that is a bit more longer process and requires a bit more research. So that's something that I would also say, maybe start straight away and just having gradual conversations with stakeholders within the area that you want to inspect. And just as you go, maybe look at, again, bite-sized chunks, do it in small increments so the map would gradually grow, except, of course, if you have a deadline. Then I would say go for it, finish it, then hand it over to someone else to try and also argument what could be another way for addressing this in case you've applied some bias to that. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Towards the end, you talked a bit about ethical design. Could you bring up some example how you use the ethical design in your own work?
Ethical design comes up absolutely everywhere. So I think if we think about accessibility and inclusivity, that is something that comes up very often. So is the thing that you're building legible, or does it just look cool? Is it usable? Is it also downgradable? This is maybe a topic that we've been addressing quite often. We build things for the current state of technology. So for example, maybe the phone that's coming out right now minus 2 versions, because why not? People don't have older phones. That might be a situation, but we should also think about downgradable software in case there is a major limitation, and also creating openness for that. It requires a bit more work, and also it depends on the situation. But that is something that is very important to keep in mind. Also, the principle of innovation versus invention. So innovation and invention is completely different in the way that invention is where you come up with something super cool and they need to find a way to do it. Innovation is where you take what you currently have and make that work. So when we think about strategy or the service of a product and we try and remedy this, maybe there's a problem statement that we want to try and address in a way, we often think about, what about we get this new thing, which requires a lot of more new things in order to work. That is one way of thinking, but perhaps not the most ethical way, because if we think about what we have right now, what can we do to almost get to that stage? It requires a bit more patience, I feel, and it's not as fun because it's not cutting edge, but it's kind of, I think, a bit more ethical way in, let's think about the recyclability of a concept. So if we think about, do not continuously think about what new things you can bring in, but how to optimize this in a new way.
Yeah. Are there any common problems with collaborative design? And if so, how do you solve those problems with collaborative design?
I think with collaborative design, communication is quite key. So I think as it stands today, we work remotely more often than not, which meant that we lean a lot more on staying in calls and sharing video a lot more than I used to. So having calls happened nonetheless. But now in the past year or 2 years, video calls has become quite prominent while you're designing. And the reason why is just kind of also to share what gestures or how you're feeling, because that also might help a bit with, if you're designing out loud with a colleague, what the intention is, because you might be mistakenly assuming something. This is a limitation where, like, collaborative design is by default online, and therefore the assumption is that you can work remote. That is not necessarily the case. For the example of pair programming, it's the same principle. So collaborative design is really good if you can work on the same thing with the person if that's a possibility. Another thing that I might think about is that there are some conversations that need to be had with collaborative design where what are the rules? Are you open to changing someone else's design? Do you pin maybe what you're working on at the moment, or is it open for all? For example, in our current project that I'm working on, we've made emojis that just signify, by the way, I'm looking at this kind of screen. So maybe don't change too much for now. If you take it away, it's open for anyone to change. So these will change for everyone, and that depends. But I would advise just trying to devise what are the rules of the game? How do we work here, and how do we also have a retro? That's pretty important. So how can we work better?
If you could prioritize one thing a company could adopt, would it be design thinking, design systems, or like UX in general?
This is a good question, because UX entails probably all of them. So I would cheat and say UX. But UX also implies that I guess you've worked with it before and you're familiar how it works. This will definitely move the company forward, but might imply you have to get someone from the outside in. Whereas design thinking, and I don't want to stick to terms necessarily, not design thinking, but the principle of thinking about problem solving a little bit differently, that might be a healthy way of going forward. The adoption of design system is quite a bulky commitment. So I would maybe prioritize that if we have readiness for that, which implies, do we have a dynamic team? Are they in touch with each other? Do we understand how the company is structured? Does everyone get to collaborate online and voice their thoughts? And are we able to improve on those ideas quickly and in bite-sized chunks enough for us to go forward? So I guess that might be the order of preference. If you have a UXer, that would be awesome, because the UXer can also maybe advocate the adoption of this type of culture, which is one of the hidden nuances of UX, is how you mitigate situations, how you promote ways of thinking, and how you tackle problem solving.
So while we're on the topics of UX in general, how do you feel where the whole practice is heading? Like, how do you think the pace of change will impact the technology, and how you will practice the UX?
Very interesting topic, because that's something that I'm wondering day by day. When I'm giving away my age here, but when I started with advertising in art direction, and then moved over to visual or digital design, and then gradually into UX, and then all of the other terms, perhaps looking a little bit at service design, but more hybridized UX, UI, I would say. Or then product design, whatever definition that is. So what's gradually happening is that my focus was solely visuals, and then expanded a little bit into a little bit of front end in order to understand how do we actually make this thing, and then building an understanding of how people work. Now, what I'm thinking about is, what is the dynamics within the company? That's something that I'm curious about. Also, how do we gather information, and how do we work ethically? So the sphere has increased by a major part, in that UXs are very much ethical advocates for the thing that we are doing. And then there are smaller bits that you can specialize in, whether that be user research, or just prototype UX, or prototype design, or visual design. These are all subsets. It seems like when profiling a UXer, it will kind of be a pick and combine set of skills. There's no one type of UXer, which is also important, I guess, for clients to ask, what are the sections that you deem to be your area of focus? What are you especially good at? And what I try and focus on is also a lot of the softer or nuanced parts of UX, which is making sure we gather information that is relevant. Are we communicating? Do we keep things exciting? Are we deeming the ethical implications to be as a high priority? And are we working fast and not holding things too close? So I think it's a very long answer for a short question. I apologize. But the ideas with UX, since technology will split into different parts and become super wide and entail absolutely anything, the role of the UXer needs to entail all of that as well, which is a very, very wide selection of practices that you will have to study. So I don't think that's something that you will be able to do as a course necessarily and cover all of it, but rather have a main focus and gradually spread on there, because it will entail almost all of the processes that we will do, similar to, I guess, there's a lot of neighboring overlaps with a business analyst, where we think about business in the same but also different way. So think about it maybe as a bit more organically, that there's a lot of overlap within the roles, but UX is gradually expanding, and the necessity of being a specialist comes in handy in certain cases, but might veer towards being a bit more of a broader, not T-shaped, but multifaceted or adaptable designer.
One question from me, actually. I'm quite interested in machine learning and AI myself. Are there any tools in that space that are like AI-based, that are making your work easier, or maybe harder, but basically like available for you to, I don't know, make the designs decision quicker? Or
yeah, Michal, we need to talk about this. This is absolutely so interesting, and it's something that I would want to go into as soon as possible, because the idea of AI and machine learning and neural networks has obviously an ethical implication, which means you need to ideate around how you're building it. But to your point, that is just a part of it. So what is the outcome, and is that ethical? But also the building of it. How do you tackle that in not necessarily only a logical way, but also include subsets of your mind, which is lateral? So how do we do this in a way that nobody has thought before? And that might be a way, by using a bit more creative tools, that might shape the way you think about the logic and kind of inform that into a newer solution. I think it's still in development. And if anyone out there is an AI UX specialist, please reach out, because I'm super curious to learn more about that. But thanks for the question, really interesting.
All right, that's all questions we have for today. Thank you, Lukas, for sharing your perspective and your experience. Thank you, our audience, for joining. If you're watching us on YouTube, give us a subscribe. If you like browser notifications, click that bell so you know about future streams. Or you can just add to calendar the one we already planned. It's going to be on 31st of May. It's Monday morning, 8 a.m. And we're going to have Joachim Sunden from Spotify. He will talk about how they work with their product and feature teams internally at Spotify. That's all for today. Thank you very much for joining us, and have a nice Wednesday. See you next time.
See you.